This morning. The ICF Training and Technical Assistance team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our new and non-traditional provider workshop series. Today, we're going to be discussing ESG and ESG-CV financial management, specifically part 2 on indirect costs. It is my pleasure to hand it to our first presenter today, Tyler. Tyler, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chris, and welcome everybody. Happy that you're all here today. So for the first hour of this training, we're going to discuss 3 topics and go through this presentation. We're going to talk about direct costs versus indirect costs. We'll talk then about the 3 indirect cost methodologies, and then finally we'll end with how to calculate indirect costs. The second hour of this training will be reserved for Q&A and just have an overall discussion on these topics. So indirect cost requirements are a component of the overall financial management requirements at 2 CFR 200 and trickle down first through these kind of 4 steps here. It begins with HUD to HCD, then from HCD to their ESG and ESG-CV grantees, which are also referred to as subrecipients. And then finally from HCD's grantees or subrecipients to their own subrecipients, which are referred to as subrecipients or sub-tier subrecipients. This training is focused on subrecipient financial management. So it's mostly applicable to HCD's direct ESG or ESG and ESG-CV grantees, and to organizations that receive ESG services from their subrecipients, again, sometimes called subrecipients. So that we're talking about the bottom 2 tiers today, or the lower tiers, I should say. So first, let's review some key terms. ESG, of course, stands for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. ESG-CV is the ESG COVID-19 Special Appropriation. Fiscal year is the year in which ESG funds are allocated by HUD. California, or CAHCD, is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, the largest ESG recipient in California. HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Recipient is an entity that receives ESG funds directly from HUD, like California HCD. Subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that receives ESG from a recipient, also sometimes called a grantee. And then finally, UGLG or UGLUG stands for Unit of Local Government. Okay, so let's look at direct versus indirect costs. The following slides are going to walk us through these 3 topics here. First, the definition of direct costs, then the definition of indirect costs, and then finally the 3 indirect cost methodologies. So direct costs. There is no universal rule for classifying certain costs as either direct or indirect under every accounting system. A cost may be direct with respect to some specific service or function, but indirect with respect to the ESG or ESG-CV award. Therefore, it is essential that each item of cost incurred for the same purpose be treated consistently in like circumstances, either as a direct or an indirect cost, in order to avoid possible double charging of federal awards. Direct costs are those that can be identified with a particular, direct costs are costs that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. This means that you can tie a string between the cost and the action or outcome. Indirect costs are incurred for a common or joint purpose, benefiting more than one cost objective, and not readily assignable to the cost objectives specifically benefited. This means that a particular action or outcome is split between more than one funding source. Every cost must be consistently treated as a direct or an indirect cost, and again, never both. So let's look into these in a little bit more detail. First, we'll talk about direct costs. This slide contains the definition of direct costs found at 2 CFR 200 413. I'm not going to read the entire definition, but the key language contained in the definition for direct costs is underlined for you. The first underlined section reads, costs that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. And the second underlined section reads, costs incurred for the same purpose in like circumstances must be treated consistently. So this goes back to the comment I made in the prior slide that costs must be treated consistently as either direct or indirect in order to avoid possible double charging. Note, for the ESG and ESGCV programs, most expenses incurred by grantees and their subrecipients will be direct costs. So put another way, direct costs are those costs incurred specifically for the ESG or ESGCV award and are not otherwise treated as indirect costs. So if they're not indirect, they're direct. Example of direct costs include payroll costs incurred to administer the ESG or ESGCV award, supported by timesheets and payroll records detailing the date and time the employee worked on the ESG or ESGCV award. Costs incurred by grantees subrecipients performing services solely for the ESG or ESGCV award. The purchase of supplies and equipment used solely for the ESG or ESGCV award. And finally, direct awards, well, I should say, including but not limited to, direct awards to eligible ESG or ESGCV beneficiaries for eligible ESG or ESGCV activities. In one of our prior slides, we indicated that there's no universal rule for classifying certain costs as either direct or indirect under every accounting system, and that a cost may be direct with respect to some specific service or function, but indirect with respect to another. This slide identifies types of costs that can be classified as either direct or indirect, depending on the service or function. The two costs are for clerical staff and for computing service or computing devices. For clerical staff, the cost is normally treated as an indirect cost. However, it can be classified as a direct cost if the time spent by the clerical staff is integral to the project, if it is specifically identified within the project, and if it's included in the budget. Likewise, computing devices are often used for more than one program or purpose, which would typically appear as a direct cost. The Uniform Administrative Requirements at 2 CF 200.453, however, allow computing devices to be charged as direct costs, even if not solely dedicated to the performance of the ESG or ESGCV award, so long as the devices are essential and allocable to the ESG or ESGCV award. So next we will discuss indirect costs. This slide contains the definition for indirect costs found at 2 CFR 200.1. The key language contained in the definition for indirect costs is underlined. It reads, indirect costs are costs incurred for a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective and not readily assignable to the cost objectives specifically benefited. So example indirect costs include rent and utility costs, accounting and administrative staff, internal auditing costs, motor pools, and computers and software. For the ESG and ESGCV programs, indirect costs are reimbursable as a percentage of direct costs. We will discuss this in more detail in the next section of this training, but it's important to begin to understand the relationship between direct and indirect costs. So the following illustrates an example of differentiating between direct costs and indirect costs. And so starting from left to right, if staff member A is fully dedicated to the ESG or ESGCV award, then 100% of their salary and fringe benefits, such as healthcare, et cetera, are allocable to the ESG or ESGCV award. Likewise, if staff member B works on ESG or ESGCV and another federal grant, then that employee's costs can be split on a pro rata basis using their hours spent per grant documented on their timesheets. So staff member A and staff member B are both examples of direct costs. Costs incurred by grantees or their subrecipients' payroll and human resources departments, however, are indirect costs, since those costs to process payroll by that department is for all of the grantees staff or all of the grantees subrecipients staff, and not just those working on the ESG or the ESGCV programs. For a grantee to charge indirect costs to an ESG or ESGCV award, their standard agreement must require that one of 3 indirect cost methods are followed and documented. The 3 methods are the 10% de minimis rate, a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or NICRA, or a cost allocation plan. Each standard agreement also includes requirements and provisions for charging indirect costs. If a standard agreement allows for indirect costs, grantees must first submit supporting documentation for one of the 3 options to California HCD and receive written approval prior to requesting reimbursement for indirect costs. So first we'll look at the de minimis rate. Grantees and their subrecipients may elect to charge a de minimis rate of 10% of what is called modified total direct costs, or MTDCs, which may be used indefinitely. And we'll talk more about MTDCs in just a moment. Grantees receiving over 35 million in direct federal funding may not use the 10% de minimis rate. So that's one criteria that would disallow a grantee or a subrecipient from being able to use this method. But if the method is chosen, once elected, it must be used consistently for all federal awards until the grantee or subrecipient chooses to negotiate for an indirect rate, either via a NICRA or a cost allocation plan. One popular component of this method, no documentation is required to justify the use of the 10% de minimis rate. The 10% de minimis method can be used in lieu of the 2 other methods. Just making sure here. So it's just important, again, that you're going to pick one of those 3. Next, let's look at cost allocation plans, which are limited to states, local governments, and Indian tribes, and cannot be used by nonprofits. So that's again, a criteria that would disallow this method to be used. Nonprofits cannot use this method. Most governmental units provide certain services, such as motor pools, computer centers, purchasing, accounting, etc., to operate agencies on a centralized basis. Since federally supported awards are performed within the individual operating agencies, cost allocation plans provide the process whereby these central service costs can be identified and assigned to benefit activities on a reasonable and consistent basis. Cost allocation plan is a document that identifies and explains the distribution of allowable direct and indirect costs and declares the allocation methods used for distribution. All costs and data used to distribute costs should be supported by formal accounting and other records. Agencies, which include grantees and their subrecipients receiving $100 million or more in direct federal funding, are actually required to submit a cost allocation plan to its cognizant agency for indirect costs. But grantees receiving less than 100 million are advised to not select this method due to the administrative burden required to complete a cost allocation plan, unless your agency chooses to do so. And that's, of course, your option. Okay, so again, just make sure that we covered this. A cost allocation plan has to be prepared by subrecipients. It's not prepared, by HCD or HUD, for example. So the grantee or the subrecipients will be preparing their own cost allocations plans for submittal to their cognizant agency for review and approval. Typically, grantees or subrecipients that use this method hire a CPA or other accounting firm to help them prepare this document, just due to its technical nature. It's also not something that you would prepare just for the ESG or ESGCV award. It's probably something that is already in place due to direct federal funding straight from HUD, for example, whether it's entitlement grants or things of that nature. And so just keep in mind that when you're if your agency has elected to choose something like a cost allocation plan, it's probably something that's already in place. Okay, negotiated indirect cost rates are like cost allocation plans, but can be used by nonprofits and institutions of higher education. A separate indirect cost rate is usually necessary for each department or agency of the nonprofit claiming indirect costs under federal awards. Grantees and subrecipients wishing to claim indirect costs under federal awards must prepare an indirect cost rate proposal to support those costs. The indirect cost rate proposal is used to calculate the rate, which is expressed as a percentage that can be applied to a program or grant to determine the amount that can be recovered and to justify the establishment of an indirect cost rate. So again, an indirect cost rate or a NICRA and a cost allocation plan are very similar. The difference being the complexity of them, whether or not they're covering the whole agency or just a particular department within an agency, and then also whether or not a state or local government is using them versus a nonprofit. Agencies that receive $35 million or more in direct federal funding must submit an indirect cost rate proposal to their cognizant agency for indirect costs. So we've talked about this term, cognizant agency. What is a cognizant agency? A cognizant agency is the federal agency responsible for reviewing, negotiating, and approving cost allocation plans and indirect cost rate proposals. All negotiated rates must be approved by the grantee's cognizant agency. And the cognizant agency is the federal agency that awards the most funds to the grantee or its subrecipients. If awards provided by HUD represent the largest amount of funds awarded by the federal agency, then the cognizant agency is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And just so for everybody's information, HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, is the cognizant agency for nearly every federal agency in the federal government. And I'm not sure why, but that's the way that it kind of landed. So before we conclude our discussion on indirect costs, remember, grantees are able to allocate and charge 100% of their costs directly may do so. So you're not required to charge indirect costs. Further, HCD cannot require grantees to use one method over another or prohibit the reimbursement of indirect costs. So if you are allowed to do so, and so once you work that out with HCD and your method is selected, then you'll be able to do so moving forward. Okay, so this wraps up our discussion on direct and indirect costs. The following are questions or takeaways for grantees to consider. Are my agency staff able to differentiate between direct and indirect costs? Does my agency intend to seek reimbursement for indirect costs? And if so, which indirect cost methods do we use and what is our rates? Okay, next we will move into how to calculate indirect costs. Okay, first we will review how to calculate indirect costs, and then we're going to review the definition and application of modified total direct costs. Previously, we stated that for the ESG CV and ESG programs, indirect costs are reimbursable as a percentage of direct costs. Not all direct costs, however, are used to calculate indirect costs. To calculate indirect costs, grantees need three items: an indirect cost rate, two items, an indirect cost rate, and then the modified total direct costs. An indirect cost rate is a tool for determining the proportion of indirect costs each program should bear, and it is the ratio expressed as a percentage of indirect costs. Modified total direct costs are the direct costs subject to the indirect cost rate, which we'll be discussing in just a moment. So this is to help us illustrate how we're arriving at what our indirect costs are. So again, it's your modified total direct costs times your indirect cost rate will equal your indirect costs. The indirect cost rate is not applied to the overall ESG or ESG CV award, but rather certain allowable direct costs, which are also referred to as a direct cost base or modified total direct costs. So again, to charge indirect costs to the ESG or ESG CV award, you must multiply the allowable modified total direct costs by your agency's indirect cost rate. So what are modified total direct costs, or MTDCs? The definitions for modified total direct costs is found at 2 CFR 200.1. Once again, the key language contained in the definition for modified total direct costs is underlined, and it reads as follows. All direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward is a modified total direct costs. Subawards are agreements grantees enter into with their subrecipients. So again, when we looked at that slide, in the beginning, there was those 4 tiers, started with HUD, then HCD, then HCD's grantees or subrecipients, and then finally the subrecipients. So a subaward is an agreement between HCD's grantees and their subrecipients. So here we break out the definition of MTDCs more clearly. On the left, we have what MTDCs are. So what is included as an MTDC? Direct salaries and wages and applicable fringe benefits, that is considered a modified total direct cost, and that is subject to that 10% plus up, or whichever indirect cost rate you're using. Materials and supplies are also MTDCs. Services such as consulting contracts, travel, and up to $25,000 of each subaward. And again, that up to $25,000 means, well, I'll give you an example. If you have a subaward that's valued at $100,000, let's say, that $100,000 is subject to your indirect costs. So if you're using the de minimis, you would get a 10% plus up on that, but it's not the entire 100,000. So it's not 10% of 100,000 or an additional $10,000. It's actually just 10% of up to the first 25,000. So 10% of 25,000 is 2,500. And then the remainder of the award, whether it's 100,000, a million, or a billion, does not receive that 10% plus up. So in the end of the day, instead of thinking, oh, this is going to be 10% of the entire 100,000 or 110,000, it's actually 102,500, which is $100,000 in direct costs plus 2,500 in indirect costs. On the right, we have what is not an MTDC. So these are examples that you cannot receive indirect costs for, or yeah, you cannot receive that 10% plus up for. So these include equipment, capital expenditures, participant support costs, and this is really common in ESG and ESGCB with respect to direct payments for rental assistance or housing vouchers, for example. And then rental costs and the proportion of each subaward greater than 25,000. Okay, so please note, although this definition of MTDCs must be used for grantees and subrecipients utilizing the de minimis rate, grantees and subrecipients using cost allocation plans or indirect cost rates may use different cost bases to determine the indirect cost rate, and therefore they may have a different definition of MTDCs. So the de minimis is always cited as the easiest and most simple to follow because it has a very specific definition of what is and is not included. It has a flat rate of 10% and no additional documentation is required. So it's as straightforward as it gets. The other two methods, however, are certainly allowable. They are more complex. And when a subrecipient or a grantee is going to use one of those two methods, then HCD needs to review the actual plans themselves and the signed agreements between the subrecipient or grantee and HHS in order to determine the effective period of the rate itself, and then what is included as a modified total direct cost within that agreement. So quickly, I want to talk about how direct and indirect costs compared to administration and activity delivery costs. It's common to assume that indirect costs are automatically considered administrative costs subject to the administrative cap because indirect costs represent costs such as rent, utilities, agency-wide services such as human resources and payroll, etc. So they appear administrative in nature. However, since indirect costs represent a percentage of direct costs, grantees and subrecipients incurring direct costs for an ESG or ESG funded activity can also incur indirect costs for the activity itself. And this is referred to as an activity delivery cost, or ADC. ADCs are costs incurred for the implementation, management, or oversight of an eligible activity. So there, again, it's kind of like you can tie a string between the cost itself and the actual activity that's taking place. Administrative costs, however, are costs incurred for the general management, oversight, and coordination of the ESG or ESGCV award and are subject to the administrative cap. So again, we'll discuss in more detail some of these concepts. Okay, so before we wrap up here, which of my agency's direct costs are in TDCs? And second, how do I determine how much my agency can be how do I determine how much my agency can be reimbursed for indirect costs from the ESG or ESGCV awards? Okay, I'm going to pause here for an intermission and we'll turn it to Chris.
Thanks, Tyler. So we will go ahead and take a 5-minute break, which puts us back at 11:31, and then we'll go into some hands-on exercises and then have plenty of time for questions and answers. I understand that this concept and indirect costs are very complicated. I have lots of questions, so I'm sure you do as well. So we will make sure that we have plenty of time to discuss them, to workshop questions with Tyler and David. So go ahead and pause the recording now. Come back at so thank you for joining us for the second portion of our new and non-traditional training on indirect costs. Tyler, as you get going into the next section, we had some folks join. Would you mind just doing a quick review of what we've covered so far? And note that for those of you that have come to the new and non-traditional training series in the past, last week we did general financial program management. This is very specific financial program management on direct costs in particular. Think about the questions you might have. Jennifer, I see you just put something in the chat. We'll go ahead and address that for sure. Think about what you might want to ask of Tyler, and you haven't met David yet, but you'll meet David in a moment. And then we will have plenty of time for discussion. This is a very complicated and technical conversation. I have been through now half a dozen indirect cost trainings, and I still have questions. So do not feel like if you're walking out of this with not all the answers, that you're any farther behind than anyone else. You won't be, but use the rest of today to go through that. We will first, as I said, Tyler, do a quick little recap for those who have just joined us, and then we were going to go into a scenario of how indirect costs are actually calculated. We'll do a few of those, and then once we're done with that, we'll again just have time for questions, answers, discussion, and it'll be much more informal thereafter. Tyler, do you mind taking it back up?
Yes, sir, and welcome back, everybody. So just to recap what we have reviewed so far, and we have a very healthy amount of time to do Q&A, so please, if you have questions, begin to queue those up. So the conversation today is on indirect costs. The first session, we talked about the difference between, or the definition of, a direct cost and indirect costs. And then we also reviewed the 3 different methods for charging indirect costs. The second part was a look at how to calculate indirect costs, and then also what the definition of modified total direct costs are. And so that brings us to where we are now. And we're going to go through what we call our lightning round, which will kind of test our knowledge. And then after that, we'll get right into Q&A. So let's test our knowledge. We have 2 kind of quizzes here. So this is the first. The next slide will provide the answers to the questions here. So what I want you to do, and we're just going to spend a moment on this slide here, is identify whether or not the example on the left is either a direct or an indirect cost. And so as you can see here, as you're jotting this down or racking your brain, coming up with the answer here, the first is payroll costs incurred to administer the ESG CV award, grantee or subrecipient rent and utility costs, supplies and equipment used solely for the ESG CV award. So again, of these three, which is a direct or an indirect, and the remaining as well. Direct awards to eligible ESGCB beneficiaries. Is that direct or indirect? Accounting and administrative staff costs. And then the final, direct or indirect, computers and software. So just take one more second here, and then we'll take a look at the answers.
So Tyler, if we could just ask in the chat for folks to address each one as you go back through them. So payroll cost, grantee, and what have you, see what we get as far as consensus in the chat while we're going through this process. That would be great.
Wonderful. So actually, I'll spend another 60 seconds here without the answers so we can give folks a chance to weigh in. Think too, as you're entering your answers. So again, a cost can either be direct or indirect, but never both, right? So you always have to pick the correct method, and that's really based off of the way that your local agency has elected to bill direct or indirect costs. So it can be one or the other, but not both. But in some of these cases, depending on how your agency actually charges your costs, it may be direct for you, but indirect for others. So the answer here is a little nebulous in that there's a justification either way. But what we want to be looking for here is the most common examples here. The examples we discussed today are these often direct costs or indirect costs. And so about a minute has elapsed. I'm curious, Chris, do you want to, maybe I'll go over the answers and then we'll see how everybody did?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. So here are the answers. How'd you do? I'll go through the whys and then we'll see what Chris came up with as well. Payroll costs incurred to administer the ESGCB award are direct costs, since the costs are directly and solely attributable to the ESGCB award. The same is true for the purchase of supplies and equipment used solely for the ESGCB award, and direct awards to eligible ESGCB beneficiaries for eligible ESGCB activities. So in all three of those examples, there is a direct line, there's a direct link between the cost itself and where it went, right? And so it's very easy to see that was for the ESGCB award. There's no indirect trying to figure it out process, right? It is clearly for that purpose. That is a direct cost. Rent and utility costs and accounting and administrative staff costs are indirect costs, since those costs are not directly attributable to the ESGCB award, but rather are attributable to multiple funding sources, right? So if you think of a county or a city, even a nonprofit, ESGCB is not the only thing you've got going on. Your government building, your gas and electric, your entire accounting and payroll departments, they're not just working on ESGCB all day long, right? They had a lot of things going on before this grant came in, and they've got a lot of things going on afterwards. Those are indirect costs because it is difficult to figure out who worked how many hours on just the ESGCB award for this period of time. It's too complicated to really try and parse all those costs out. And so that's an indirect cost, right? That is indirect because of the complexity of attributing those costs to the particular final cost objective, which is either the ESG or the ESGCB awards in our examples here. And so that's why you can either use the de minimis or the two other methods, indirect cost rates or cost allocation plans. Finally, the little trick here, computers and software can be either direct costs if used solely for the ESGCB award, or indirect if used to perform tasks or services for multiple funding sources. So again, you just want to look at how, what the purpose of these individual items are, in this case, computers and software, and how they are being used, right? So every cost must be treated as direct or indirect, but never both. So if you have computers and software that you're going to charge as direct, then you cannot also include those costs in your 10% plus up if you're using de minimis, for example. So Chris, how do we do?
Very well, actually. I think the only thing that tripped folks up was the computer and software, because it could be either answer. So their answers weren't wrong. They just didn't say either or both as you did. So I think folks really got it. That was really great answers.
Well, I am so pleased to hear that because it can be a very dense topic. And yes, it was a trick question, so I didn't expect anybody to get that one right. It was kind of just to have some fun. All right, so here is the next test. And this one's going to be a little bit more in depth here because it's going to require some math. Using the 10% de minimis method, identify the indirect cost budget based on the direct cost budget per line item of cost, and I'll go into this in just a sec. And then the total budget, which is the combination of both the direct cost budget and the indirect cost budget. So here what we have is a budget, right? And this is an ESGCV grantee's budget, or it could even be their subrecipient's budget. And let's say, for example, this is for street outreach, for example. And so you have a $485,000 ESGCV award directly from HCD. For this street outreach eligible activity, you have $120,000 in direct costs budgeted for staff wages and benefits. So that's how much that your staff, timesheets are going to be needed in order to implement this program. You have $50,000 budget for equipment that you'll need to purchase in order to carry out this activity. $250,000 in direct participant support costs. So these are actual cash value awards that would be awarded to ESGCV beneficiaries. So these are the folks that have been impacted by the COVID disaster, for example, or I should say pandemic. You have a $5,000 line item budget for supplies and materials. And then finally, you have a $70,000 subrecipient agreement. So you as an ESGCV grantee have a subrecipient agreement for $70,000. And this agreement is for that nonprofit agency, your subrecipient, to provide these services. So if we're using the 10% de minimis method, then that means that we have a 10% indirect cost rate. And if you remember, we get to charge 10% of modified total direct costs. So if we have, and I'll just give you an example here, staff wages and benefits, if we remember that definition of what is an MTDC, what is a modified total direct cost, on the left, it had a list that is included, and on the right, it had a list that is not included as an MTDC. So I can tell you the answer here to the first line item, and then I'll give everybody a moment to do the rest. Staff wages and benefits are a modified total direct cost, which means you are subject to the 10% plus up there. So if you have a direct cost budget of $120,000, you're allowed to get 10% of those costs, those modified total direct costs of 120,000 equals $12,000. So your final budget for staff wages and benefits under this particular example, direct and indirect costs is going to be 120,000 plus 12,000 for a total of $132,000. So now what you want to do is go through the remaining 4 examples, identify whether or not the cost is or is not a modified total direct cost, and then determine what that indirect cost budget is going to be, and then what the total budget is going to be. And we'll give you just a few moments here to kind of work through this. So as we continue to kind of work through this here, I'll give you a hint. 3 of the 5 line items here are considered modified total direct costs. So that's hit number 1. Okay, hint number 2. One of these line items is a modified total direct cost, but you cannot get 10% of the full amount. So keep that in mind as well. Is in every circumstance except for this one, you would get 10% of the entire direct cost budget. Okay, so let's take a look at the answers. Okay, so as I said previously, staff wages and benefits and supplies and materials are both MTDCs, and therefore the direct costs incurred for those line items of costs are subject to the 10% de minimis plus up to recoup indirect costs. So you can see here, you get the 120,000 for staff wages and benefits plus 10%. Or 12,000 equals 132,000. For supplies and materials, a direct cost budget of 5,000 plus 10% or 500 gives you $5,500. The subrecipient agreement is also an MTDC, but only up to the first $25,000 of that subaward is an eligible MTDC, and therefore only $2,500 can be recouped for indirect costs. So although we had a $70,000 direct cost budget, we can only take 10% of up to the first $25,000, which equals $2,500. And so that total budget there for direct and indirect costs is $72,500. Equipment is not an MTDC, and therefore no indirect costs can be recouped for that line item of cost. And the same is true for both direct participant support costs issued to eligible ESGCB participants. So in both of those cases, we have a direct cost budget of $50,000 for equipment and $250,000 for direct participant support costs. Both of those cases, not eligible MTDCs, so $0 there. The total budget remains the same. And then when you add up all 5 of those line items, when you've got your direct cost budget of $485,000, you have an indirect cost budget of $15,000, and your total ESGCB award now is $500,000. So Chris, how do we do?
And there's actually a minor correction. The direct cost is $495,000, and so it would be $510,000.
Oh, oops. So the math here is off. Is that right?
That's what David is saying, and that is what a lot of folks got was 510.
Well, wonderful. Then that means that David and the rest of the class is correct, and the slide is the one that's incorrect. So let me, I want to be able to. So David, again, just make sure that I understand this number here is 495, and this number here is 510.
Correct.
Okay, thank you for that. So it's just the bottom 2 numbers that got miscalculated here. So if you had $495,000 in direct costs, $15,000 in indirect costs, and a total budget of $510,000, then that means you get an A+. Alrighty, I believe that is it for today's slides. So I'll pass it back now to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tyler. Thank you, David, for catching that math mistake. I'm not great with math, so I'm glad that folks who are doing that. It seemed that folks answering for both of the last 2 kind of workshop questions did a pretty good job with it. So we know that there are folks out there that definitely understand some indirect cost principles. I think at this moment, we want to go ahead and ask just the few questions that we have. Once we are through those few questions, this is your time. Come off mute, come join us. If you would like to have a conversation, ask a question in the chat, raise your hand and we can unmute you. However you prefer to discuss with us, please do. So Tyler, first question. Can indirect cost be used as match?
Okay, so I'll just admit right now, I'm not familiar with any requirements for ESG and ESGB with respect to match. But generically speaking, the answer is yes, because indirect costs are always calculated as a percentage of direct costs, and direct costs are eligible, to meet a match requirement. Then yes, the answer is yes. Direct and indirect costs should be allowable for meeting a match requirement. But again, you'd have to really look at the specifics of the requirement and whether or not there were any exceptions to the rule.
And we do have plenty of folks on the phone, Tyler, who don't get ESGCB, but do get annual ESG, where match is a concern. But you are correct. For ESGCV, there is nothing you have to concern yourself with as far as match is concerned. Question number 2, what about the sub-recipients rent and utilities for a place that is used solely for ESG services? Would that be direct or indirect?
Okay, so this is a wonderful question. It's a great question. If this goes back to one of the very first slides that said, there's no universal rule for classifying direct versus indirect costs. When we think of rent and utilities, we often think of those as indirect costs because a building almost always serves more than one funding source. And again, a common example is, an UGLEG, a city or a county's government building. They're doing a lot more than just managing the ESGCV program for a couple of years, right? So the rent and utilities would be an indirect cost for the ESGCV award because obviously there's a lot more going on than just our little grant here. Now, if you have a subrecipient who is carrying out an ESG or an ESGCV eligible activity that is 100% for just your funding source, right? Then you can call that a direct cost because they're not servicing anybody or anything other than 100% of what you have funded them. And so under that scenario, there is nobody else to charge for this indirect cost. It's just you. And so in that case, and again, the example is you have an ESG or an ESGCB subrecipient that is 100% funded by you and is doing nothing else but providing your service in that building, then rent and utilities would be a direct cost, not indirect.
Thanks, Tyler. Another question. So actually a follow-up to the question you were just answering, Tyler. The subrecipient has opened another office just for ESGCV. So in that circumstance, that sole use that you were just discussing would apply.
Yes. So, and I'm not familiar with the scope or magnitude of the necessity for opening another office and what that looks like in terms of, yes, there's nothing nebulous about this scenario. This new office was opened for and is being used exclusively by an ESGCB award that, again, this county is funding, right? So I, as the grantee, they're not receiving any donations. They're not providing any, additional services that are related to your award. They're not receiving multiple funding sources, all for ESGCB, but it's coming from 3 different cities, right? The example here is they have one award from one agency, which is me, the ESGCB grantee direct. I received an award from HCD, $100 million. I gave 10 million to this subrecipient. They opened a new office with that $10 million and do nothing but spend that $10 million. The answer is yes, that is a direct cost.
Thank you, Tyler. A couple of the questions here. Is there ever an instance where documentation we required for indirect cost justification aside from the initial approval of the method?
So again, another great question. The quick answer is no. No additional documentation is required once you have provided the documentation that establishes the method. So again, when you're using the de minimis method, it's real simple because it's just, hey, I'm going to apply 10% of modified total direct costs, and I'm never going to have to submit anything else again. With the other 2 methods, what you will need to provide is a copy of the actual cost allocation plan or the indirect cost rate plan. And those plans are developed locally by you, the grantee, or your subrecipient, often with a CPA or a consulting firm, or maybe you can just get it done with your experts there locally. It is then that plan is submitted to HHS, your cognizant agency, for review and approval, and they will come back with an approval letter that says, yes, your rate, let's say 29%, is approved based off of the information that you provided us. And so when you go to use that 29% for the ESG or the ESGCB award that you received from HCD. Then HCD will need a copy of both that plan and that agreement, and then they will need nothing else, with an asterisk. The asterisk is this: those plans need to be updated annually. They're always based off of the local government's last, or the nonprofit's last fiscal year. So it's not as if you just get, HHS says you get 29% and you get to use that for the next 500 years. No, no, no. Every year you have to submit a new plan. You have to update your existing plan, and you have to base it off of last year's financials. And it may say, okay, based off of last year, it used to be 29, now it's 27. And so HSS will say, yep, I've reviewed your financials, 27 makes sense. So if you're going to use another method besides de minimis, so again, we're talking about negotiated indirect cost rate agreements or cost allocation plans, in both of those instances, you will have to submit updated plans and updated agreements approved by HHS annually to HCD in order to continue to use those rates. So effectively, they expire until you get your new agreement. Now, they don't always expire on time or at the fiscal year. HHS takes a long time. So there are, there's some gray area there as well. But so I want to just answer the question kind of simply here. When it comes to what type of documentation do I need to submit, there's really two areas one would consider. One is to get the rate approved. And then the second is when you're actually billing the rate. So I just talked about the documentation that you would need to submit to get the rate approved. De minimis, nothing. The other two, annual copies of the plan and the signed agreement. When it comes to justifying what you're charging when you're doing that 10% plus up, or when you're doing that 29% plus up, there is no documentation there. You do not have to prove that you spent 29% of your direct costs on actual rents, right? Or 10% of your salaries were actually for indirect costs. That's the beauty of indirect costs, is once you put the work in up front, or with de minimis, once you say, hey, I want the easy way out, then there's no afterthought. There's no proving that you spent that money.
Thanks, Tyler. Okay, another question. This is a little bit technical, so we may need additional information. How about regular vendor service contracts, such as laundry or a cleaning service for the ESG program? Is the total cost applied for the indirect cost rate, or only the first 25,000? So for service contracts, indirect cost rate methodology.
Again, excellent question. So the difference between a contract and a subrecipient agreement is very distinct, and it's spelled out in 2 CFR 200. But when you think about, and so the quick answer is service agreements, like consulting services, like laundry, like the other examples that you named, all of those are considered contracts. Those are services, and so they are subject to the full 10%. Okay, subrecipient agreements are very specific legal agreements that allow a recipient like HCD to pass on, we're called pass-through entities, to pass on the responsibilities of all of the grant conditions, everything that's contained in the Federal Register and the ESG regulations and 2CF, the whole gamut. Besides very key, grantees must retain certain responsibilities, but the rest you can pass on those responsibilities to another government or another nonprofit. That is a subrecipient. When you hire a consultant, when you provide laundry services, when you enter into a contract, you are not passing on the responsibility to report to HCD or to monitor this or that, right? You're passing on certain requirements. Yes, you have to comply with federal, state, and local law, but you're not passing on the requirements of actually administering and implementing the grant. So that's the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor. Contractors do, and I want to be clear that I'm saying contractor in terms of a service provider, like you said, the laundry service provider, that's a contract, that's a vendor, full 10%. But the subrecipient that procured that contractor, right, that is where you as the grantee may only receive $25,000 or $2,500 of the subrecipient agreement, which is 10% of up to the first 25,000. So I hope that makes sense.
If it does not, ask a follow-up question. They're coming in pretty regularly now, Tyler. I will go ahead and read this one. Are sub-recipients required to have an indirect cost allocation plan or a negotiated indirect cost rate approved by the cognizant agency? Are sub-recipients allowed to request the approved documentation from the sub-recipient?
So again, great question. When in the beginning, when we showed that slide, there's, the first level is HUD, then HCD, then HCD's grantees, and then the sub recipients. Oops, and I hope I'm not messing up the monitor here. Every tier, every layer is allowed to charge indirect costs. So HCD charges its own indirect costs to HUD based off of its own method. It could use one of the three methods, and it has its own definition, and then it has its own scenario, right? Like it has HCD operates in a model of awarding all of its funds to subrecipients. In this case, the ESGCV grantees. So HCD is allowed to charge its indirect costs based off of its own scenario. Then you, the ESGCV grantee, same thing. You get to pick one of the three methods. You have your own way that you're doing business. Maybe you're implementing some of it. Maybe you have some sub-tier subawards. So you have to negotiate those budgets and you have to submit that documentation to HCD in order to get that all approved. The same exact process should be followed between you, the ESGCV grantee, and your sub-tier subrecipients. So yes, you have to ask for a copy of their indirect cost rate, their NICRA or their cost allocation plan, or if they elect to use de minimis, that's fine. You must ask them because you need that documentation in order to justify the use of that rate. Remember, a subrecipient agreement means that HCD passed on that responsibility to you, and you are passing that responsibility on to your subrecipient. So you're all required from the top down to comply with 2 CFR 200. And the only way for you to make sure that you are complying with that requirement is to actually ask this information of your subrecipients. So yes, you need to collect that documentation.
Yes, not only are you allowed to, you ought to collect that information. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is being required to ask is not the same thing as being required to have an indirect cost rate. Sub-recipients, though, I'm not sure why, may elect to refuse to seek reimbursement for indirect costs, but you want to have that kind of in writing beforehand.
Thanks, David, for that. And I'll make a guess on why. This is very complicated. And maybe that's why we wouldn't be asking for indirect cost rate. Let's go to the next question. Tyler, you mentioned that all of our federal awards would have to use the de minimis if that is the method used for our indirect cost rate. De minimis can't be used just for this grant. Would our approved indirect cost rate through the internal business center, which I'm not familiar with, would that be sufficient?
Okay, so I'm also not familiar with that, and let me just broaden this question. What the questionnaire stated, what I stated accurately, which is when you're going to use the de minimis method, you must use it uniformly for all of your federal awards. What I want to expand that to say is you have to pick any one of those three methods, and whichever method you pick, you must use that one uniformly for all three awards. So it doesn't just apply to de minimis is what I'm trying to say. And again, that is what the slide said. So you did read that accurately. I want to make sure that I'm correctly stating now and expanding it to say every agency, whether it's HCD, whether it's an ESGCV grantee, or whether it's one of the subrecipients, all of them must select a method and use it for all of their federal awards, uniformly, or not charge indirect costs at all. So if your agency or one of your subrecipients already has an approved indirect cost rate and they are using it for, let's say they're using it for CDBG or home or whatever other funding sources, maybe they're using it for Department of Transportation, right? And so you're talking about counties receive multiple funding sources, not just HUD. Department of Education, I'm not even sure what could be out there, but nonetheless, you already have an indirect cost rate. And boom, all of a sudden your Department of Housing and Community Development gets this, big ESG CV award from ESG. And maybe they don't even know that the other agencies are using this indirect cost rate. And they attend today's training and they go, you know what, let's just use de minimis. That seems real easy. Well, guess what? That other rate is the one that since you're already using that rate somewhere else, way over in engineering, right? Or somebody you don't talk to often, if they're already using that for other federal awards and you don't know, and you just use de minimis, you're now on the hook if you were audited, because you made the mistake there. You used the incorrect method. So maybe I'll ask you to restate the question if I didn't answer it for you, but the long and the short of it is this: you must pick one method no matter who you are, and you must use that method consistently until you elect to use a new method.
I think you did answer it. If not, obviously we will get a follow-up question. I think the piece of the question we did not answer is about the Internal Business Center, which we're not familiar with. So we really can't answer that piece of the question. I have another specific question, Tyler, that relates to your the question you just answered. We use the de minimis rate for our other grants from HUD and Treasury. Each grant has its own de minimis rate. Some are 20%, others are 10%. Is that okay?
So de minimis is 10% period. Okay. So it's never 20%. It's 10% or no percent. So maybe I would recommend maybe this question here, clarify their question, because I'm not quite sure in any instance where you would be allowed to use a rate higher than 10% if you've elected to use de minimis. Now, I'll also say this. There have been instances where subrecipients have said, we don't want to use the full 10%. We do want to use de minimis. We are using it everywhere else, but we only want to use 8%. And then this is where things get a little bit tricky. There is a rule which says subrecipients do not have to charge indirect costs, okay? And that is true. You don't have to. The 2 CFR 200 and the whole indirect cost regulations were written such that federal awards do need to bear their fair share of indirect costs. So if you are a local government or a nonprofit and you receive a federal award, then yes, you do have indirect costs that are supporting that award. And yes, the federal government should bear its fair share. Now, if you say, I don't even want to deal with all of that indirect cost stuff, or if you say, I would rather use my award for direct beneficiaries, I want to give as much to the people as I can, I will figure out my indirect costs somewhere else. That is your choice. So if you want to use less than 10%, it's a little tricky the way you would do that. What I'm saying is this, I wouldn't say, oh, just apply 8%. What you would instead do is say, I'm only going to apply my 10% to these select items of cost. I'm only going to do it for salaries and fringe benefits. And the rest of the indirect costs that, yes, I can charge to you, my federal partner, I can charge to them. I'm going to use other funding sources for that. So don't you worry about it. That is okay.
And I think we got a few more pieces of clarifying information, Tyler. I think what the situation is we have a 10% de minimis, but there might be some of our projects that have a larger administrative non-indirect cost that might be larger. Can you talk a little bit more about indirect costs versus administrative costs that might look similar, but they're not?
Yes, absolutely. Let me see. A lot of this is true in California in particular. A lot of local governments and nonprofits are used to having this administrative budget. And the administrative budget is where you charge things like salaries and benefits and rent and utilities and overseeing your subrecipients. All of that is admin. And I got 7.5% or whatever that dollar threshold may be for those purposes. Admin is not direct and indirect costs. It's a whole separate, in fact, admin doesn't even live in 2 CFR 200. The definition of an administrative cost actually lives in the ESG regulations, right? Those are, HUD is what says, this is an emergency shelter cost. This is an HMIS cost. This is an administrative cost. And this is an activity delivery cost. So what I'm trying to think of is a good example here. If we had a a subrecipient agreement, like we keep talking about. And that subrecipient agreement is $70,000. So I, the ESG grantee, have awarded a sub award to, 1, 2, 3 subrecipient for $70,000. That's a direct cost. And I'm charging that to, emergency shelter, right? I'm not charging that to admin because that's an actual eligible activity. Now, if I wanted to charge indirect costs on that, and I can, and I'm using the de minimis method, then I could charge $2,500 of indirect costs. And those indirect costs inherently are to pay for my payroll department. They're to pay for my rent. They're to pay for my utilities. That's what indirect costs are for. Now, where am I going to charge that $2,500? Am I going to charge it to my admin budget, which is capped at 7.5, or am I going to charge it to the street or the emergency service or the emergency shelter line item, because that is where the subrecipient agreement actually exists. That subrecipient is providing emergency shelter services. Well, I have the option as the ESGCB grantee to pick. If I want to reserve my admin budget, if I want to keep that 7.5% for everything else I've got going on, then I am allowed to charge that extra $2,500 in indirect costs against my emergency shelter total budget. And so in that case, it would be 70,000 direct, 2,500 indirect for what, 72.5. And so that 2,500 is actually an activity delivery cost. So when it comes to whether or not your indirect costs should be treated as admin or not, you have to look at where the direct cost originated. And if the direct cost originated in an eligible activity, then you can charge your indirect costs as an ADC, an activity delivery cost, because the direct cost originated in the eligible activity. Now, if you've run out of money there, or you've already allocated it to all of the services that you were going to provide, but you still want to recoup indirect costs, you can charge that to your existing administrative budget. It's not going to give you any more money in your administrative budget, but you can charge it as an administrative cost.
Thanks, Tyler. And if we didn't quite get that situation correct, Susan, you still have follow-up questions, please let us know. We do have one more question, Tyler, and this may be our last question of the day, unless folks decide to come up and talk with us. If we are paying rent on behalf of a client,
Agnes is spelled A.
Sorry about that. Let me try that again, Tyler. If we are paying rent on behalf of a client, we cannot charge indirect on that. Is that correct? They would be considered, they being the costs, would be considered participant support.
Wonderful. Yes, that is exactly right. So participant support costs, like if you're giving an ESGCB or ESG beneficiary help with their rent, that is a participant support cost, and you would not be able to charge 10% on top of that. You would not get that 10% de minimis. One thing that we didn't really cover today, which is also not an MTDC, is capital expenditures. A capital expenditure is something like if you were to give money to rehab an emergency shelter, right? So you gave, there's an existing emergency shelter and they got $500,000 to rehab that facility. That's also not an MTDC. And in that case there, just like participant support costs, you would not get that 10% plus up.
Thanks, Tyler. I've not seen any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and see. David, do you have anything you'd like to add today that we haven't discussed already that would be useful for this group?
The final thing that I would say is if you have an indirect cost rate, or you believe you may have an indirect cost rate, I would urge you to look at the definition of cognizant agency. So, we may not know who Internal Business Center is, but if that is the cognizant agency responsible for reviewing your indirect cost plan or negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, then that would be the agreement that we'd be looking for, or the approval. It's not just we made this and then we got approval from some other department head. There's usually a federal agency that's responsible for reviewing that plan, and they're the ones that are going to give you approval.
And David, it might be useful to discuss the work that you've been doing around indirect costs as well with HCD itself. Some folks might be interested in that particular piece of knowledge. Would you mind kind of just filling us in, maybe at a very high level, not getting into all the details, but maybe just the high level of what that work entailed for indirect costs as it relates to e-civis?
Sure. So both Tyler and myself, and really the ICF team as a whole, with all the grant administrators, have been working with each grantee to do the math component of the indirect costs together. I think the largest point of confusion with indirect costs really comes at the de minimis level. And the reason for that is if you're doing a cost allocation plan or you have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, you've already put in a lot of work, and there's kind of a set structure or process that you have to follow and get approval from. So if you're doing that, you would know how to charge the indirect costs. And the issue really comes at the de minimis level because it's 10% of modified total direct costs, not 10% of your award. And so understanding that difference or that distinction is really important so that you know what your budgets should look like and how much each line item results in, X amount of indirect costs, so that you really know what your budget is, which is super important, especially when you're talking about federal grants, to make sure that you're able to capture all of your direct costs and indirect costs, and also classifying those costs appropriately. It's possible that a direct administrative cost is a direct cost rather than an indirect cost, and you want to make sure that you can seek reimbursement for that.
Appreciate that, David. Thank you very much. I have a few other questions, a clarification, a question. Tyler, just for our own education, Internal Business Center, that is what tribal nations use. So I've actually, Josh, thank you for that clarification. Josh, we will connect with you separately through the one-on-one training and technical assistance we have for tribal nations engaged through ESG-CV. So Seetha, Ashley, or I will follow up with you specifically on this actual question, because it is a little bit outside of my expertise right now, and we want to get you that correct answer. So do not worry, we will follow up. Tyler, last question I think I have. Nope, I guess there is another. Oh, yes, here's the question. I'm sorry, I got lost in my screens. So here's the question. What are the considerations that the relevant authorities take into account when an agency applies for a negotiated indirect cost rate? What are the do's and the don'ts?
So I believe what the question is if a local government, if an ESG-CV or ESG grantee or one of its subrecipients, nonprofit or otherwise, wants to apply for an indirect cost rate via a cost allocation plan or an indirect cost rate agreement. So the question is, what is HHS looking for? I believe that's the question. And what are the do's and don'ts there? HHS actually has published guidance, and I'm not sure if we can provide this, Chris, as a follow-up or something, but there's HHS has guide, it's like literally called the guide for developing indirect cost rate proposals and cost allocation plans. And that really walks you through the process of what is required in order to submit one of those proposals to HHS for review and approval. I can tell you that they're not necessarily like very voluminous documents. I mean, some of them can be very complex, but some of them can be 10, 15 pages. And when you're, what they're looking at is, first you need to say, what is this covered? What is this covering? Well, it's covering my entire county of San Bernardino, or it's not the entire county. It's just the department that does HUD federal awards, because everybody else, doesn't deal with these things. So you're kind of defining who is and what is covered. The next thing that you're looking for is what is your direct cost base? What is your modified total direct costs, right? So what types of direct costs did you include in your analysis to say, these are the direct costs we want. These are the direct costs that we will seek direct reimbursement from. These are the indirect costs that we need to use an indirect cost rate to approve. So what you do is you actually, just like when we did the math, here's our modified total direct cost, here's our rate, this is how we arrive at our indirect costs. You do something very similar where you say, here's our direct cost, and then here's our direct cost base. And so this divided by that is 29%. And that's how you are able to arrive at, oh, I need 29% because, 29% represent all of the costs that I cannot get reimbursed for directly. It's typically like a financial P&L statement. It's really just, you would pull it right out of your close of books in your accounting software where it would say, here's all of my accounts. Here are all of my direct costs. Here are all of my indirect costs. Because of my modified total direct cost base, I'm eliminating all my direct costs. And here I have arrived at my what I believe should be my rate. You submit that plan, in accordance with the guidance. There's a certification statement you need to sign. Like I said, you typically want a CPA or a licensed, knowledgeable professional to prepare something like this. And once that's, packaged and put together, if it appears reasonable, and if somebody at HHS can cross off all the checklists, then your rate's approved.
Made it sound easy, Tyler? I bet it is not. I do not see any more questions. So I want to go ahead and just say thank you, Tyler. Thank you, David, for this presentation today. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out this PowerPoint and the recording and a survey for you to fill out. Here are some resources for you. We have the 2 CFR 200 subpart E on cost principles and the CPD notice 1307, allocating staff costs between program administration costs versus activity delivery costs. This is specific to CDBG, so if that's something you're interested in. Next slide, and here we have just a few more appendices and other resources for you. So I want to say very much thank you for attending this California Housing Community Development Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the new and non-traditional providers workshop series. Our next session next month will be on program monitoring. Hope to see you all there. Until next time, be well.